The US military is preparing for war with China. And when I say that, I don't mean it figuratively. I'm not exaggerating. There have been multiple reports in mainstream media outlets acknowledging that the US military is preparing for war with China, and soon as 2025. I'm going to go through the evidence that shows this and analyze just how dangerous this situation is. I had been planning on writing an article about this, but my friend and colleague, Denny Haifong, wrote a good article, and I republished it over at geopoliticaleconomy.com. So the articles that I'll be discussing today, the reports, you can find links to all of those sources in his article, and I will link to that in the description below. So I want to start this analysis today looking at a terrifying article that was published in the Washington Post, one of the leading newspapers in the United States. And it does not mince words. It says very clearly, title, U.S. General warns troops that war with China is possible in 2 years. It's from January 27th. I'm just going to read a few of the main points from this article. China could be at war with the United States 2 years from now, a top Air Force general predicted in a bombastic and unusual memo to troops under his command. The general who wrote this is named Michael Minihan, and he is the head of Air Mobility Command, so he oversees the Air Force's fleet of transport and refueling aircraft. And he warned personnel to speed their preparations for a potential war with China. He said, quote, "My gut tells me we will fight in 2025. So he's predicting war in 2025. Minihan then directed airmen who are qualified to use a weapon to, quote, fire a clip into a 7-meter target with the full understanding that unrepentant lethality matters most. And then he said, aim for the head. So this is a top general in the Air Force instructing his troops to train to kill Chinese soldiers with unrepentant lethality. Aim for the head. This is as clear as it gets that the United States is preparing for war with China. And we've seen other reports suggesting the same thing. The Wall Street Journal published an article in October titled, U.S. Defense Strategy Casts China as Greatest Danger to American Security. And I'm just going to read a few quotes from this. The Biden administration unveiled a new defense strategy, this is back in October, casting China as the greatest danger to American security and calling for an urgent, concerted effort to build the military capabilities to deter Beijing in the decades to come. So it's another way of saying war with China. If not hot war, at the very least, cold war with China. And the defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, who we should keep in mind, until he became defense secretary, was on the board of directors of Raytheon, the weapons corporation. He wrote in this defense strategy, quote, the People's Republic of China remains our most consequential strategic competitor for the coming decades. And they note that the Pentagon's National Defense Strategy is mandated by Congress, and every 4 years, the Defense Department issues a new one. Back under Donald Trump in 2018, they declared China and Russia to be the main threats to U.S. national security, and now the Pentagon is stressing that China is the top threat. The Wall Street Journal pointed out that this National Defense Strategy came soon after the Biden White House's National Security Strategy, which was released earlier in October, and the theme was that China is the major competitor to the United States. The Pentagon's defense strategy describes Russia as an acute threat, but it suggests that while Russia is a worry, it is a more transitory danger compared to a rising China with a larger economy and growing military. So anyway, in short, what this says is that the U.S. military has assessed that Russia is a short-term threat, but China is the main long-term threat. Now, I would also add that China and Russia are strategic partners, they're allies, and they're integrating their economies more and more closely, using each other's currency. They're also doing military exercises together. So when we talk about China and Russia, increasingly their geostrategic partnership shows that if the United States is going to wage war on China, it's going to also be waging war on Russia. I mean, the U.S. is already waging a proxy war on Russia right now in the proxy war in Ukraine. And I've done a report showing how the CIA and a NATO European ally are already carrying out sabotage attacks inside Russian territory. So the possibility of this to escalate further into World War III is very dangerous, if World War III hasn't already begun. Now, the Wall Street Journal pointed out that the Trump administration's national defense strategy from 2018 presented China and Russia as the two principal threats confronting the U.S., but Biden administration officials said their strategy took the Trump era strategy as a starting point and is giving greater emphasis to China. So, like I said, the Pentagon 5 years ago declared Russia and China to be threats, but now they're saying that China is the top threat, even more than Russia. So that's another article that should be very concerning, but it's going to get even more concerning. I mean, the danger that we're talking about here. The Financial Times published an article. This was in January, and it's titled, U.S. Military Deepens Ties with Japan and Philippines to Prepare for China Threat. And this once again shows that the U.S. military is preparing for war with China, and it is doing so in collaboration with Japan. And this is, of course, quite scary because Japan colonized China and other parts of East Asia. Japan committed genocide. Japan was allied with Nazi Germany. Now it's allied with the United States. And this article notes that the U.S. and Japanese armed forces are rapidly integrating their command structure and scaling up combined operations, and as Washington and its Asian allies prepare for a possible conflict with China, such as a war over Taiwan. So the U.S. and Japan are preparing for war against China. And the article notes that the U.S. and Japanese militaries have seen, quote, exponential increases just over the last year. And that is according to Lieutenant General James Bierman, who is the top U.S. Marine Corps general in Japan. And he said that the U.S. and its allies in Asia are emulating the groundwork that has enabled Western countries to support Ukraine in its proxy war and their proxy war against Russia. And here, this top U.S. military general makes a direct parallel between the war that NATO is waging on Russia right now in Ukraine and the war that they plan on waging against China. And they said this top Marine Corps official, top Marine Corps general in Japan said, in 2014 and 2015, we prepared for future conflict, training Ukrainians, providing supplies and such. We call that setting the theater, and we are setting the theater in Japan, in the Philippines, in other locations. So the U.S. is preparing for war with China, just as it was preparing for war with Russia after the U.S.-backed coup in 2014, after the United States backed this violent coup that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected government, which had been geopolitically neutral, and installed a pro-Western regime. And then Russia annexed Crimea, although there was a democratic referendum, and even Western polling firms that are anti-Russia admit that over 90% of Crimeans wanted to join the Russian Federation. That was used as an excuse by the West to impose sanctions on Russia and then prepare for the proxy war that we see today. So now that preparation is similar to the kind of preparations that the U.S. military is carrying out with its allies in East Asia. At the same time, Japan, the former fascist power that committed genocide and colonized parts of China, the Financial Times notes that Japan is embarking on a radical security policy shift that will include increasing defense spending and deploying missiles capable of hitting Chinese territory. Japan right now is remilitarizing rapidly, and it's moving to spend more on its military and engage more military activity than at any time since World War II, since the fascist Japanese Empire. And at the same time, we see that the US and Japan are working together to try to surround China with offensive missile systems. This was reported in the Japanese newspaper Nikkei, and this Nikkei journalist named Annie Sharp, he noted, the U.S. will establish a network of precision strike missiles along the so-called First Island chain as part of $27.4 billion in spending to be considered for the Indo-Pacific theater over the next 6 years. He reported that in 2021. So we're talking about from 2022 until 2027, 2028. So in 6 years, the U.S. is going to spend $27.4 billion to put offensive missiles on the First Island chain. I have a map here. That includes Japan. It includes the northern part of the Philippines. It includes Taiwan. So the U.S. plan is working with Japan and the Philippines to put offensive missiles in those areas aimed directly at China. These are not defensive anti-missile systems. They are $27 billion worth of offensive missiles preparing for war on China, preparing for bombing mainland China. This is the report in Nikkei titled U.S. to build anti-China missile network along First Island chain.